Hi, everyone. This is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our great sponsors, Your Dolce Vita, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abitativa Casa. And today, my guest is Steve Bruno. So, welcome, Steve. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
I remarked a little bit about the photo behind you. Is that your hometown by any chance?
It is actually from Greci, Italy. So that is where my grandfather's family's from. So it was exciting. I found it online. I'm like, hey, let's have that for my background. Our goal is to buy a house over there or a flat for when we retire and be snowbirds, only not in the United States.
Yeah, no, that's a super idea for sure. When and why did you start researching your family?
Basically what it was, my grandfather and his sister, they were orphaned. My great grandparents died very, very early. My great grandmother, Paulina, died in 1925. My grandfather was a year and a half, and his sister was 6 months. And 4 years later, in 1929, my great grandfather Antonio, he was killed in an explosion at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. So that basically it left the children orphans. They bounced from orphanage to orphanage, and we didn't know a lot about the family. My grandfather and my grandmother were divorced, and he actually passed away very early in life too. He passed away in 1981. For me personally, I don't remember him. So for the longest time, my father really had no identity about his father's roots. And I started about 9 years ago, just doing some research with the photos that we had from Grandpa Carlos' files and everything from when he passed, and it just it became an obsession, as you well know.
Yes, it is. So that's kind of sad that he had no idea about his roots. So do you know when they came to America?
It looks like my great grandfather Antonio came, it was before 1900, and he was actually married before, which is through the research I found. And uh, my grandfather had a half brother that I don't believe anybody knew about.
Oh,
So
wow.
when they immigrated here, the family went to Wisconsin, and that's where my great grandfather Antonio had his first wife in Wisconsin. They must have divorced, and he came to Ohio, and that's where he met my great grandmother Paulina, who was also married before. So there's so many different marriages back then that I don't think anybody had a clue about.
Yeah, so that's interesting because so then he came very early, before I guess the major wave. And not too many people know about that. I did interview a couple of guys who wrote a book about it, how Italians were swindled into New York and then there was no work and they just people from places like, Ohio and Pennsylvania came to America and just grabbed them, or not
Yep.
grabbed them per se, but took them there because they had no work in New York.
Right. The interesting part, when my great grandfather passed, we have letters from his brother from Wisconsin, and would have been my great uncle Pasquale. He was a pipe fitter in Racine, Wisconsin. So we have his letterhead, and we actually have the letter, discussing the death of my great grandfather and who was taking care of the children. And it's been such an interesting journey, learning all this stuff. And luckily, before my dad passed a few years ago, I was able to show him some of the stuff. And he got the biggest smile on his face because he was proud of his Italian heritage, because both my grandfather and my grandmother, both sides were Italian. So I mean, my dad was Italian through and through. And
Uh,
what was interesting, my father was a junior. And through the research that I've done, my father's name should have been Carlo. And it was actually, his birth certificate says Carl. Back in the records in Italy, I tracked that my grandfather was listed as Carlo in in the church records. And if my dad knew that, oh my gosh, he would have had a field day with that. Being known as Carlo Bruno. I mean, you can't get much more Italian than that.
no, no, that's for sure. And I actually have a a Bruno or two in my for my mom's family in Bari. But Bruno is that's a pretty common name in Italy.
Right.
Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, and it's said throughout the whole country. Some names are specific to certain regions, but that kind of goes throughout the whole country. Um, so what town in Italy did they come from?
They were actually my great grandparents came from Greci. So we do have a lot of Albanian. When I did my DNA, I'm 5% Greek Albanian, which makes sense. Even the dialect, it's more has a little bit more Albanian influence with the language.
Yeah, and so is that is because I'm not familiar with that. Is that in Puglia or is it in Calabria?
Right around the Avellino.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, yeah, and that's true. With a lot of the languages on that coast, there's a lot of the Albanian influence, Greek influence.
Hmm.
Where in other parts there may be some more Spanish and things like that. I'm gonna ask a question. I don't know if you probably don't know, but do you know why that they came so early? Any idea?
Be honest, I don't. I would love to understand because it seems like they came in waves. Uh, my great grandfather was the youngest. He had many, many siblings, which I've through the years, you know, after great grandfather died, my grandfather tracked relatives down because I have pictures of what would be my great uncle Celestino in New York. And I actually traced some cousins down that I spoke to on the phone a couple weeks ago. When I showed them the picture, they said, "Oh my goodness, that is Grandpa Charlie's basement. That's where I grew up in." And it sure enough, it was my grandfather going to visit up in the Bronx. And it's just been so interesting, to finally find relatives that we didn't think we had. We thought we were the last of the Brunos, but they're finding we're everywhere.
Well, yeah, no, and I've had some of that stuff happen myself. I found um, my cousin Linda, our families were so closely connected during the 50s and 60s. And, we had, well, I mean, it was possible we met when we were very, very, very young, but I had no idea why my grandmother's family came because most of her family stayed over there. But it was really amazing to find, my cousin Linda here, that we was researching the same people, and then also, finding cousins in Italy, my dad's first cousins, which completely just blew me away. I had no idea.
Hmm.
So it is really, really something when you come across that. Um, and the other interesting thing that you mentioned before, it wasn't very common for people to get divorced, late 1800s, early 1900s.
Exactly. I guess it makes me wonder because there's so many letters that was in my grandfather's belongings that we have. And there are letters talking about, well, if basically talking about his first wife. And after everybody passed, and it's hard to piece everything back together. And it's interesting. Actually, the one of the relatives of the half brother reached out to me and said, "Look, I think we have the same great grandfather." And sure enough, before the birth certificate in Wisconsin, it actually had Antonio Bruno on it. Then her new husband must have adopted because he went by the last name Williams instead of Bruno.
Wow. And that's something that the letters have survived this
Yes.
entire time. That's really, really great to have that.
And when my grandfather retired before he passed away, he moved. He always dreamed of going out to the desert and panning for gold, and that's exactly what he did. And the interesting part, as I'm researching that area out in Arizona, I'm seeing all these hits of Brunos, and so he must have known that there were relatives out there as well, because there were a lot of Brunos out in that area in the Maricopa County of Arizona. Because my grandfather, he was actually getting ready to move back to Ohio and live with my mom and my dad and my brother and I. And a week later, my mom got a phone call that he had passed. And it was sad because I didn't get to know him because I was so young when he died. I mean, he lived here, but really didn't, I was too young. And I would have loved to pick his brain and to say, well, tell me all these stories.
Yeah, and I think my dad's father passed when I was like 2 months old, and my grandmother, I guess I was 11 or 12 or something. But I never thought to ask them anything about Italy, and they didn't really, talk about it that much,
Right.
Um, and when people sometimes people ask if you could go back in time, if you could talk to anybody, I was like, my grandparents. That's who I'd want to talk
Absolutely.
to. You know, forget about Kennedy or this guy, that guy. No, I want to talk to my grandparents and ask them, why did you
Exactly.
come?
Yep.
So now, did you make the connections through DNA, or did you find anything that really such surprised you when you did the DNA?
Abs Actually, a few surprised me. So when I did my DNA, there was here in Canton, there was a man named John Mazzarella. He has written a book, The Greci Cousins, and he did so much of the preservation of the records in Italy years ago. And come to find out, we are, I believe, fourth cousins. Unfortunately, I tried to reach out to him, but he's not well, and um, is in a hospital and basically in a nursing home and doesn't remember anything. But it's so fun to trace back. And my family in Ohio, they grew up in a very small town called Waynesburg, Ohio, very, very densely populated with the Italian immigrants. And just seeing all that and kind of piecing back the pieces of some of the orphanages that my grandfather and his sister lived in. And come to find out, I went to high school with a relative of one of the major caregivers of my grandfather. It was, I believe, a great aunt of this person, and we had that connection. And it's just some of the Italian little stores and markets. They were from the same town in Italy that knew my family, and they knew my grandfather and a lot of their relatives.
And as I talk to people around the country, that's one of the things that really amazes me is that there were all of these Italian enclaves all around the country, and like you said, small places where because of work and because one person knew another person, and they came over, and it's I kind of say this all the time, so it's no surprise to the regular listeners, but us New York Italian Americans, we just think they all came to Little Italy.
Absolutely.
So it's like I said, it's really, really very interesting to find that all of these places existed and things like that. So now, how long were they in the orphanages for, and what did they do when they came out?
Um, I mean, basically until they were adults. I mean,
Wow.
they bounced around, and I actually found my would be my great aunt Thelma was my grandfather's sister. Um, I tracked her family down because she actually died almost to the day 3 years after my grandfather died, which I found very, very interesting. I go, wow, it is almost the exact day that grandpa died, that his sister died. Um, but yeah, I've talked to their families and Thelma's daughter who lives 20 minutes away from me. We had a conversation and she was in the same boat. She goes, my goodness, I knew nothing of my mother's history. And we were able to compare stories and, as far as photos. And she's like, wow, this is unreal. She's like, I have gone my whole entire life not knowing we had relatives beside the immediate family. I go, we were the same way.
Yeah, that's really something to be able to make that connection. And when you make those connections, it's like uh you're not like strangers, you know?
Right. And it was pretty emotional when you talk to these people because when I talked to my cousins, a couple weeks ago, we had a three-way call with some of the cousins and the one actually remembers my grandfather. Because she's much older than me, she goes, Steve, I remember seeing this man at our house knowing. She's like, was your grandfather in the medical field? I go, yeah, he was in the medical labs. And he goes, I remember Uncle Charlie was just enamored because he was in the medical field. They held him to such a high regard because he was in the medical field. He goes, I remember your grandfather.
That's
And
great.
it was just so it was surreal. And if my dad were here, he would just be amazed. It's like, oh my gosh, because he was so excited when I started piecing all the pieces together. So
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Well, yeah, and that's kind of what happened with my cousin. Her my grandfather and his brother had an embroidery shop in New York City. They would do beads for bridal crowns and things like that. And when we finally got to meet Linda, my first cousin Paul, who knew the family with the background with some of those people, she actually her grandmother had saved beads from my grandfather's shop, and she brought my sister and my cousin and myself beads from his shop, which you know who thinks that these things. I'm a firm believer in things don't happen by accident.
yep.
There's some force out there driving this stuff. I don't know who it is, but there's something
Yep.
going on.
My grandmother on my mother's side always said, she's like, Steve, you can't control anything. Everything happens for a reason. And we've lived our life like that. Um, Obviously there was some divine intervention that all of us had met all these cousins after all these years. So I it's truly just it's amazing.
Yeah, and we're blessed, I guess, in the era that this research now, people were doing it 20, 25, 30 years ago, had to rely on microfilm and go into, trying to find records. And then, we have so much stuff online now and the DNA, you know,
Right.
uh, that kind of helps in the research. Now, have you been back to Greci at all?
We are actually going in 2027. We are basically taking 2 weeks. We're going to do a whole tour of the country. We're going to fly into Venice, get a train pass, and literally travel the country for 2 weeks. We're going to end up in Greci, knowing that it's a very, very small town. Some of my cousins that have been there said, make sure you get in touch with the city center because they will be able to pinpoint exactly where your relatives lived because it's such a small town that they know everybody that has ever lived there. And I just found that very, it's going to be cool to see all that. t- chances are the houses aren't still there, but
Oh, you'd be
just
surprised. You'd be
I
surprised.
was gonna say with the ruins and everything that are all through Italy, it's my first time to Italy back in '02. I fell in love with it. I go, I could pack up and just live here full time.
Yeah, me
It's
too. Me
it
too.
is just it's a different, I guess they actually value the family time, which United States, I mean, love it here, but it's one of those, it's all business here.
Well, yeah, and you grew up in a different era than I did. I still remember that because my grandparents came from Italy, and a couple of my aunts and uncles were born there. So I grew up hearing the language, and I grew up with that, more of a close tie.
Hmm.
But yeah, when you get to the hometown, it's people, I tell people that's the real Italy. When you get to the hometown, even if you don't know anybody, uh they know we don't belong there, so in some cases, I mean, I did on tours where it was kind of set up so people were expecting us, but they'll come up and ask you like, who are you? And
Yeah.
you say my great grandfather was so and so. Chances are they may know, or they may remember, or uh somebody has something to say about it. It's But when you walk down those streets, there's a sense of belonging.
Hmm.
So you're gonna love it when you get there. And So I was gonna ask you too. So now your mom's not she's not Italian, right?
Correct.
And what nationality is she?
We call her Heinz 57. Mostly my grandparents on that side were English and Irish, and honestly, that's where a lot of people think that I get my re red beard from. But my father, he had very dark hair, and he had when my father was younger, he basically had the bright orange beard, and it's funny because people think I dye my beard this color. I go, no, this is, I mean, now that I'm getting older, it's sprinkled with some white. Luckily, you can't see it on camera, but it it was just that was him. He
Well, and
had,
my cousin John and his sisters. They're 100% Italian, and they have red hair. We used to call him Johnny Red.
yep, yep.
Yeah, because of
And
his red.
the funny thing, I have an older brother. He actually takes more of my mom's side. My mom's side was very tall. My brother's almost 6'7". And I joke, I go, yeah, I have dad's short, stocky Italian side because I'm shorter and I'm built exactly like my dad. And my dad's Air Force picture when he was first in the Air Force, I mean, you put it side by side with me and we're twins. I mean, you cannot deny that was my father.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I actually there's a painting of my the ninth great grandfather, and there's an amazing resemblance. Genes are a strange thing, that's for sure. So now, have you researched your mom's family?
Yeah, that's been done many, many years ago. I mean, back to I think the 1500s. So that was always the case with dad. He's like would always joke with my mom, "Yeah, we know where you're from. I have no clue where I'm from." So that kind of prompted me to start this.
So when did
And
so when did her family arrive in the United States?
uh that I don't know. We because they're my mom's family is from I can't say the South. I mean, it's more West Virginia, um, bordering Ohio area. But I believe probably this early 1800s is when their family came over. Now, my mom was the youngest of seven, so my grandparents would be, if they were here, about 115. So they were very old. Um, so that was the difference. Now, on my dad also has a full-blooded sister, and my Aunt Donna, if you were to put a picture of Aunt Donna next to great grandma Paulina, they are twins. Now we know exactly where my aunt gets her looks. She took after great grandma Paulina.
Yeah, when I met my father's cousins in Italy, they're they're probably, I guess, 93, 94 now or something like that. And as soon as I walked into the room, one of my dad's cousins looked just, not just like my grandmother, but the resemblance was there like that. I mean, as
Hmm.
soon as I saw her, I said, "Boy, she looks like my grandmother." Uh, and it is strange. My kids are adopted, so with through the and they've met their birth parents. So, my daughter has been able to trace back to England, back to she's actually a distant dispenser from, Diana's family. So I was able to trace her all the way back to there through one of her lines.
Hmm.
Uh, and she's a granddaughter of Daniel Boone and Captain Morgan. I didn't even know Captain Morgan was a real guy. I thought he was the guy in the rum bottle.
That's the only way I know him.
Yeah, he was actually a real guy, and he was, I don't know if he's the grandfather of Daniel Boone, great grandfather or something like that. Yeah, they're all in that family. Uh, it's pretty funny when you come down to it. Uh, so yeah. So back to your mom's family. How'd you get back that far to 1500 then?
I actually didn't do that. I think it was a lot of some of my mom's other relatives that had a lot of the records when they lived down south. So that one was easy. We've always had that information. But the my dad's was the hard one.
Yeah, no, and the unfortunate thing is that Italians in Italy, they don't do DNA.
Hmm.
So, there's you could probably count it on one hand
Yep.
the people that I found in Italy that have done DNA, and they're so distant. I, both times we went, I said to myself, yeah, I'm gonna buy some DNA kits and bring it and see if they'll do it. And yeah, I didn't wind up doing it. And they don't need to do DNA because everybody's buried down the block.
Right. They they know exactly who everybody is.
Uh, yeah, so you had mentioned that you had gone to Italy before. Were you just out of school or?
We actually, a group of friends went because one of our friends got married over there in the Napoli area. Giovanni's parents still lived there, so we had a great personal tour guide of everything. We were there for about a week and a half, and that was before I started doing all the digging around, and you going looking back, I'm like, wow, I wish I would have started this sooner. That way, you know, I had somebody that lived in the area that could help out.
Uh, Yeah, I know. We lived in England for 2 years. So the second year we were there, we did like a 10-day trip to Italy. Um, and I wasn't doing this stuff either. And I had no idea that my father had family there, that, close family, no
Hmm.
less. Uh, and they would have been, I guess, in their mid 60s or something like that at the time. And boy, I could, every time I think about it, it's like, oh boy, I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I knew that these people were there.
Yep.
Because the same thing, they live outside of Naples. They live the older cousins. They live in a place called Torre del Greco, which is, I guess, a half hour outside of Naples or something like that.
Hmm.
Uh, and had we made that connection back then, it just would have been a whole different thing. I mean, I would have been living next door to him myself. uh, and my at the time, my dad was still alive. And he had said to us, oh, probably it must have been like 1983 or four, just casually. I don't know why. He just mentioned that he had family in this place called Torre del Greco. And we didn't really spend time in Naples. We went from Rome to Sorrento and spent a week in Sorrento. But back then I had no problem driving around. I wouldn't do it now, but we were driving and we saw the sign, Torre del Greco. And, I said to my, oh, that's where my wife said he had family. I mean, my father said we have family. I mean, like I said, it's like I could kick myself every time I think about it. Uh, and my mom's family, most of them came. So uh, there's if there's anybody there, they're distant, distant, distant. But with my grandmother's family, my father's mother, nobody came. Only two people came. So there's a ton of people over there. All her brothers and sisters stayed there. So I have a ton of cousins over there now. Uh, and the nice thing is, when you make that connection with cousins over there, they're just so gracious and so nice, and they're so thrilled to find that they
Right.
found somebody in America. I think they're more thrilled than we are that we found them, that they found us, if you know what I mean.
Hmm. Yeah,
So yeah.
I'm still trying to track some people down over there for when we go. You know, not that, hey, they're going to be open up their doors, but it would just be fun to have that connection to say, okay, maybe they can take a day and show us around the area.
Well, yeah, and you have plenty of time if you contact, like I said, if you contact the Comuna early, or tell them what's going on, and that you're coming, you'd be surprised. And even if you just ask them like where to stay, or what's a great restaurant, or things like that. Uh, I mean, I'll tell you one story that somebody told one of my early interviews. Um, she was looking for she had a genealogist that she was working with. She's up north in the Piedmont area, and they were making a trip. And she said, I didn't know where to look, so I was just looking for places to stay, and I narrowed it down to two. And I just did like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and I picked one. And when I contacted them, they said, "Why are you coming here? This is such a small place. So, don't you want to go to a big city?" And she said, "Well, my family's from there." And they asked who the family was. It turns out that the place that she picked to stay at was left to either the mother or the grandmother of the people who owned it now. So she was staying in a place that her great grandmother, I think great grandmother, left to these people.
Oh, that's cool.
Isn't that wild? So,
Yeah, that whole saying, it's a small world, even though it is halfway across the globe, it literally is a small world.
yeah, yeah, and you never know what you're going to run into. That's for sure. But like I said, you're absolutely gonna love it there. So, if you were gonna give advice to somebody who was just starting out doing their research, what would you say to them?
Well, easiest thing, don't give up because you're gonna go in so many different circles. And if you have the money, hire a genealogist because that would save so much time. But it doesn't give you that same thrill of the hunt. You know, when I first started, there were so many different directions I could go because, like you said, the Bruno last name is was very common. So I had a few, had to start a tree over because I had to delete a lot of things because hey, I grabbed the wrong one because it was it was just like that. So a lot of it took hours, hours upon hours. At some points, I had to finally put my membership of Ancestry on pause because I was spending too much time. You got to take those little breaks, and no, it can't be done in a day. I mean, it's I'm still finding things. I'm finding cousins, and it's just it really is exciting, especially since my father isn't here anymore to for me to show him. I get to show my nieces and I get to show the rest of the family that really they really didn't know a whole lot about the Bruno side of the family.
Yeah, and that's great to be able to pass that kind of stuff on. And like you said, you mentioned breaks. Uh, I found that I'd walk away for a month or two and come back, and then all of a sudden something that was I couldn't find just it pops up. You know.
Exactly. Exactly. It's kind of like, haha,
Yeah.
I was hiding out and I guess you can find me now. And that's exactly what it is. The cousins that I just found up in New York, it was basically a Facebook group. You know, they posted, "Hey, does anybody have information on such and such?" I go, "Hey, it could be a relative of mine. I have some of those names." And sure enough, it would have been my great uncle Celestino. That's who she was researching. And here I have pictures of Celestino and his son and my grandfather. And it's just so fun how people get connected and can compare. I would love to see some, you know, if I found that relative that would have other pictures of my grandfather, because we don't have a whole lot.
Well, yeah, and and I find, when I do come across a photo, I like almost sharing it with other people as much as I was for me to find it and say,
Hmm.
"Hey, look what I found." I found a picture from here, there, or uh wherever. And people, "Hey, gee, I never saw that photo before. Where'd you get that?"
But
Um,
for the longest time in my grandfather's belongings, there was a black and white picture of a man and woman and 7 kids. Had no clue who they were. But after doing, you know, because as we were adding up everything, great grandma and had my grandfather Carlo and his sister Delma. We didn't know about any other children. Didn't realize, oh my gosh, she had children with her first husband. That's who's in the picture. Then we kind of figured out, wow, this is great grandfather Antonio and great grandmother Paulina, and these are all the kids, and the baby on the lap is my grandfather.
mm,
It's just so fun to have those discoveries. And as I posted some of those pictures, it was very interesting because a lot of the comments that I was getting was, well, judging by the picture, it looked like whoever's in the man of the family looked like they were very wealthy. And I'm like, well, that doesn't sound like our family, but just how they presented themselves, their clothes, a lot of times, you know, ex exactly what they were wearing, back then. And it looks like they had quite a good paying job, back in the day. And they would
yeah,
almost
yeah,
almost have to support 7 children back then.
yeah. I suppose so. Yeah, unless you were on the farm and you had them all working.
Right.
It wasn't so easy. Um, well, listen, Steve, this has been great fun. I appreciate you taking the time and giving your stories and tips to other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure and look forward to catching up on all your other podcasts. I got the one about the surnames, which was very interesting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I try to look for new things every now and then.